Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, whoa, Tiger Bay.
Well, croeso cynnes iawn I Bai Caerdydd. That's a warm welcome to Cardiff Bay. We have just come out of the Cardiff Bay Visitor Centre. The purpose of our journey this morning is to see what was going on in Cardiff Bay before Cardiff Bay came into the picture in 1987. In fact, what I'm going to do is take you back into the previous century, long before any of you can remember, right to 1811, because at that time, Cardiff was merely a village around Cardiff Castle, just 1 mile from the seafront, in an area known as St John's Parish. Now, south of St John's was St Mary's Parish, and that's the very land we're standing on at this moment. But in those days, all this land was waterlogged, marshland, or tidal in some way, right up to the little village. Now, at the same time, in the Rhondda Valley, iron and then subsequently coal was being excavated and making its way down to the village of Cardiff along the Glamorganshire Canal. All we had were a few little quays along the banks of the River Taff, which flowed down Westcott Street at that time and was located near to Cardiff Castle. But by that early part of the century, these quays were no longer large enough to export the amount of tonnage that was coming down from the valleys. And it just so happened that the Marquis of Bute, John Crichton Stewart, the second Marquis of Bute and 7th Earl of Dumfries, owned all of this land known as St Mary's Parish. And he decided he would reclaim this land from the sea and build Cardiff docks. It was a tremendous effort because the Marquis was unable to get the labour force to actually dig out the dock because of Chartist rebellions and social upheavals that were taking place across the country. And in order to get his dock built, he went to Ireland and imported 200 Irishmen into South Wales who actually dug out the first of the Bute docks in 1836. And from that point on began the transformation of Cardiff from the village into the city we recognise today. And with that as a preface, I guess we can start our walk along the seafront and I'll tell you the rest of the history of how the village grew into the city. Yes, now we've just passed the Norwegian church, but of course that is a new location. It hasn't always been on the seafront, and it was actually built in 1868, and I'll tell you more about it later when we see the area where the Norwegian church originally stood. But as I was saying to you, the Marquis built the first dock in 1836. But dock building would actually go on until 1907, not so many years ago, over there at the Alexandra Dock, where you can see the blue cranes towering into the skyline there. The Marquis became so wealthy that he decided to rebuild Cardiff Castle. Once he moved into it, it set a trend for all the wealthy people living on the seafront to begin to follow the Marquis into the new suburbs. And as the wealthy people moved into those new areas, seamen from the 4 quarters of the world began to settle in what became known as the docks and a half-mile up Bute Street, Tiger Bay, where you could literally see the world in 1 square mile as more than 50 different nationalities of people came and lived together, I might say harmoniously together, in this one area on the seafront. Now also, if you can see, obviously, the very distinctive pierhead building in red terracotta stone there with its clock tower. And if we look over here, we can see a willow tree. And both these have been landmarks to seamen throughout the century, like my grandfather and father who sailed around the pierhead of the Penarth Peninsula there. Once the seamen from the area could see these landmarks, they knew they were safely home as they sailed into Cardiff docks. Now, if you look across the bay, you can see a red brick building with a square tower. That used to be the pump house, which used to open up 3 lock gates, which allowed ships to sail into the Mount Stewart dry dock to get their engines repaired. Now, the actual repair shed is now National Techniquest, the largest hands-on interactive science museum in all of Europe, which actually attracts more than 250,000 visitors each year into the Cardiff Bay area. Next to it is Landsea House, which was the actual headquarters for the dry dock, and of course today it's been transformed into Harry Ramsden's, the largest and most glamorous of all his restaurants in the world. And right in front of us we can see wooden derricks or pontoons, which used to have platforms which allowed pleasure seekers to go down onto paddle steamers like the Waverley, the Cardiff Queen and the Glen Usk, and they could sail across the estuary to Weston-super-Mare and other exotic locations on the English coastline like Ilfracombe and Minehead. Victorian pleasure seekers came down here when they got off the tram cars. The local boys used to run over, carry your bag, Mr. or Mrs. or Madam perhaps, and they'd make a penny taking their bags over to the queue shed. Now you can't fail to notice the Roman numeral water level markers. Notice them on the side of the entrance to the Dispute Dock there. Those markers reassured sea captains it was safe to sail their ships up into the big docks. And remember, in 1913, Cardiff docks exported 14 million tons of coal in 1 year, and huge ships queued 2 and 3 days at a time to get in and out of our docks. Now, as I've already told you, this was a major seaport, and in the local community, the seamen here exported all this Welsh coal to the rest of the world. The seamen from our community, through World War I and World War II, took their lives into their hands by taking ships out onto the sea. Many of our grandfathers and fathers lost their lives out at sea, and we've often wondered why there isn't a memorial to represent the courage of these men. And now this year, we finally have a memorial, as you can see right here on the seafront. This is meant, of course, to be the hulk of a ship, but as we can see from this side, here is the face of a universal seaman in repose with his face down to the seabed. Here we are standing in front of the Pierhead building, a magnificent structure designed by William Frame 100 years ago. This is the building that houses Associated British Ports, who are the company which runs what remains of Cardiff docks. It's a magnificent structure covered in all kinds of ornamentation, from gargoyles to symbols, industrial symbols, bestial creatures like lions, and it has a motto, Earth Ddŵr a Thân, which is by fire and water. And Associated British Ports, as I say, still runs Cardiff docks, but not the Cardiff docks of the past. We only have the Roath and the Alexandra. All the other docks began to decline in the 1950s with the petrol coming into the picture and replacing coal. So fewer ships came in and out of Cardiff docks. And that is the reason our mudflat grew in front of the city, because in the heyday of shipping, all of this mudflat was dredged on a daily basis so that ships could sail into the East Bute Dock and the West Bute Dock on the other side of this grand building. Well, if we look over to the left, we can now see the remains of Bute Crescent. These grand Georgian and Victorian buildings once came all the way down to the pierhead at the seafront, and it was the homes of the shipping magnates and coal merchants, and they lived in these houses and they could look at the ships sailing into the Oval Basin, making their journey into the West Bute dock, the first of our docks to be built, to export our Welsh coal, and this they could witness from their very windows and their front doors. Because of the prosperity that took place in our docks, there was a need to build a merchant exchange, and it was decided to build it right on the seafront where we now see the Industrial Maritime Museum, and this meant that some of the Georgian homes had to be demolished in order to build this magnificent structure. However, in 1892 this building caught on fire, but after the fire completely destroyed this building, it was rebuilt and it became Powell Dufferin House, built in the Dutch or Flemish gabled architectural style. Of course, Powell and Dufferin were famous colliery owners, and this was the source of wealth in those days, and being wealthy men, they could have a building like this named after themselves. Now, shall we go across and see Bute Crescent and cross over the entrance to the Oval Basin? Come along.
Got it.